Though Menes unified Egypt thousands of years ago, for some reason they continued to call it the two lands over and over in history. And if you've ever read the original sources, they write this all the way until the Greek and Roman era, meaning that there is something about the lands that have always been considered separate from one another, to the point that there has been a hypothesis that at one point there was a coalition that ended up breaking apart and made these two lands, and this was just deep in their memory. This is called the Thinite Coalition. But if we think about it in Egypt, when we look at the way they portray themselves, the pharaoh is always the biggest and baddest guy in the room. Scary as he is, for some reason, there's something about it that seems fragile. To have statues so large to show everyone the size of your power. But why? Is it because your power isn't that solidified? Perhaps. Or is it simply a way of showing that you descend from godhood? Given how religious ancient Egyptians were, it's quite obvious that it must be a combination of both. These two lands, though they were ruled completely by the pharaoh, had so much separation that the priests of Amun really ruled large parts of Egypt under the behalf or the behest of the pharaoh. But so many incidents have happened in history where when the priests didn't get what they wanted, they would really go after the pharaoh. And so, is it true that the power lay mostly with the pharaoh, or did the pharaoh show this much strength in order to hide the fact that the power lay with the priests? Perhaps that is why the gods are present in this palette of Menes, or Narmer, as he's called sometimes. This shows how the original ancient Egyptian gods were portrayed wholly as animals, and that this whole thing of them, their gods being portrayed as half human and wearing the masks of man, is more of a African thing that they just picked up. But we'll talk about that later, because in other places that's considered monstrous when a man has a mask of a animal and then has the body of a man. Pharaohs themselves would have names like Amun Hotep or Amun Horus or Amun Ra, or some name that would reflect their divinity through whatever the main priesthood or the main understanding or religious understanding at the time was. It would take until the 18th dynasty when the priesthood of Amun would take over and allow a female to be in charge under the promise of the expansion of their temples in Karnak. This priesthood would then legitimize her power and make her seen by the population, because of her veneration to those same gods, as a true pharaoh. They would continue to do this for other gods or other god kings. All pharaohs were god kings, really, like Ramses II or Ramesses Saint. And then later on, they would take power themselves, showing who really was boss. Though today, when we think of religious people, we think of them as these dudes who only deal with religion and have been sectioned off from society. This was not the case back in the day, as a lot of the high priests of Amun, and high priests in a lot of places, high priests of Amun would end up being viziers, or started off as viziers, were viziers. in Egypt, meaning high ranking officials of the pharaoh. And these high ranking officials held land, they held economic power. And again, this was good and bad for the pharaoh because it meant, firstly, you have to be legitimized by the pharaohs, just like how Akhenaten's name had Amun in it in the beginning. And then when he removed the name Amun and he replaced it with the Atum and changed the capital and the religious networks, they came for him and they made sure that the power would go back to the temple of Amun, to the priesthood of Amun. Even Tutankhamun's speculated death is that he was killed so that they could solidify this, even though Tutankhamun, who was called Tutankhaten when he was born by his family, had voluntarily, I guess, changed back to Amun to be Tutankhamun. It appears that in the very, very ancient times of ancient Egypt, Hathor held a way higher position than a lot of other gods, which is probably why she appears so frequently in this pre dynastic period of Egypt, but later was overtaken by gods, which I would assume would be lower than her, given that Hathor gave birth to a lot of the higher ranking gods that would later appear. The power of the high priests of Amun, going back to them, was not static at all, unlike the power of the pharaoh. As you can see, a good example would be Herihor, who became a priest of Amun during the reign of Ramses the 11th. He would start as a military man, and because of his devotion to Egypt and his pharaoh, he would climb up the ladder. First, he would climb and become a priest, then he'd become a high priest, and then he would become a vizier and unofficially become as strong as the pharaoh himself, though this was termed unofficially. He ruled while the pharaoh was still alive, for the most part, Thebes. Because of this high ranking position and unofficial split called Wehen Musut, there was a temporary separation between the upper kingdom of Egypt and the lower kingdom of Egypt, separated unofficially, but really it was in the most official way a real separation, and it would only be fixed later when one of the pharaohs in the next dynasty would put it all back together, unifying Egypt officially once again. But this was not the only time that the priesthood of Amun would dare do this to the pharaoh. For once the pharaoh was gone, they took power. The final pharaoh of the 20th dynasty was this Ramses, but after him was Mendes, Amenemesu, Susenes, Amenemope, Asorkan the Elder, Siamun, and Sosones II, all high priests of Amun. These high priests of Amun had moved power so much that they became the official pharaohs of the 21st dynasty. The high priests of Amun almost fully strengthened this claim by marrying the daughters of Ramses, the obviously black daughters of Ramses with their hair braided, showing how some of these mummies' hairs sometimes unravel from this braid. I couldn't help myself, but Anyway, I want to compare the Sumerian wings versus how the masks of Egypt resemble Africa and how the wings resemble Sumeria.